Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We asked the Ouija board how my mum died. Now I'm getting calls from her number. Part 1. A stupid idea that seemed fun at the time. Okay, before I start this, let me just say, I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or spirits. I wasn't even the one who suggested using a Ouija board. It was my friend Jake. He's always been into that paranormal stuff. Ghost hunting shows, creepy YouTube channels, whatever. I just thought it would be something to laugh about later. You know, a fun night with friends. So, yeah, I was skeptical, but looking back, maybe I should have been more cautious. Here's the thing, my mum passed away last year. I don't like talking about it, but it wasn't a peaceful death. She was found in her car, which had crashed into a tree on the outskirts of town. The police ruled it as an accident. Her brakes failed, she lost control, case closed. But for some reason, I never really bought that. Something about it didn't sit right with me. But I didn't think about it too much. Until Jake, Jess, and I were hanging out last weekend, and Jake randomly brought up his new Ouija board. We were all sitting around in my basement, just scrolling through our phones when Jake leaned back and said, "You ever wonder what really happened to your mom?" I froze. He was staring at me, a little too intensely for my liking. Jess punched him in the arm. "Dude, not cool." No, Jake insisted, rubbing his arm where Jess hit him. "I'm serious. What if we asked the Ouija board? Maybe we could find out, like, if she's still, around." I laughed it off, but that question stuck in my head. A part of me wanted to know. I had questions that were never answered. Was it really just a freak accident? Or was there something more? So, after an awkward pause, I said, "Screw it. Let's do it." We cleared off the old coffee table and Jake pulled out the board. Jess was already complaining. "I don't know if this is a good idea, guys. What if something goes wrong?" Jake ignored her. He placed the planchette in the center of the board and looked at me with this weird gleam in his eye. "You ready?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. The thing about Ouija boards is that you expect it to be all Hollywood, candles flickering, cold breezes, spooky whispers. But no, it was just quiet, normal, too normal. I started feeling ridiculous, but I didn't want to be the one to back out. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and Jake started with the usual stuff. "Is there anyone here with us?" "Nothing." "Can you give us a sign?" Still nothing. Honestly, I was about to call the whole thing off. Jess looked relieved. But then Jake said, almost casually, "How did Cole's mom die?" I don't know if it was just timing or what, but the planchette twitched. At first, I thought one of them was moving it, but Jake and Jess both looked just as shocked as I was. It slowly slid to the letter B. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was just a fluke. Then it moved to R. Now I was freaked out. I didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension in the room rise. Jess looked pale, and Jake's face was completely serious for the first time since we started. The planchette kept moving. "A!" I pulled my fingers back. "Okay, this is dumb," Jake snapped. "Dude, it's almost done." The planchette landed on the letter K. "Break," Jess whispered. I couldn't breathe for a second. That's when the lights flickered, just for a split second. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. Jake grinned nervously. "All right, that's enough for tonight. Let's wrap it up." We didn't even bother saying goodbye to the board like you're supposed to. I wasn't sure if that even mattered, but we were all freaked out enough to just call it a night. Jake and Jess left pretty quickly after that, and I was left sitting in my basement, staring at the Ouija board. I didn't know what to think. My mum's brakes failed. That's what the cops said. But for the board to just spell it out like that, it didn't feel like a coincidence. Maybe Jake was messing with me. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Either way, I shoved the board into a closet and tried to forget about it. But later that night, things got weird. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when my phone buzzed. I groaned, thinking it was just Jake being an idiot. But when I looked at the screen, my heart nearly stopped. It was a call from my mum's old number, the number we disconnected after she died. At first, I thought it was some glitch, like maybe the phone company hadn't recycled the number yet or something, but the screen just stayed lit up, her name staring back at me. I didn't answer it. I just let it ring until it stopped. My heart was racing. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until the call ended, and I let out this shaky exhale, and then, as soon as I calmed down a little, it rang again. Same number, same name. My mum. And this time, I swear, I heard someone breathing on the other end when I let it go to voicemail. Part 2. The voicemail I didn't sleep that night. I stared at my phone, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for another call that never came. The first one freaked me out enough, but that second one, with the breathing. I didn't even want to touch my phone after that. I kept convincing myself it was some kind of technical glitch. It had to be, right? Dead people don't make phone calls. But that didn't stop me from tossing and turning until the sun came up. The next morning, I finally worked up the nerve to check my voicemail. My hand shook as I unlocked my phone and saw that notification staring back at me. One new voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it. Something deep in my gut told me I shouldn't, but curiosity got the best of me. I tapped the notification, and after a few seconds of dead silence, I heard it. It wasn't words, just breathing. Slow, ragged, like someone was struggling to catch their breath. I froze, the phone pressed to my ear, barely able to move. The breathing went on for about 10 seconds, maybe 15, and then, right before the voicemail cut off, I heard something else. It wasn't clear, but it sounded like a faint whisper. It sounded like someone trying to say my name. I nearly dropped my phone. My first thought was to call Jake. He'd think this was hilarious, but I needed to talk to someone who wasn't about to tell me I was crazy. As much as I wanted to believe this was some sort of prank, I didn't think Jake would take it this far. And even if he did, how the hell would he call me from my dead mum's number? I hit his contact and held the phone to my ear, half expecting to hear that same creepy breathing when it started to ring. But Jake answered on the second ring. Yo, what's up? His voice was casual, like nothing had happened. I was half relieved. You didn't mess with me last night, right? I asked, cutting right to the point. Huh? He sounded confused. What are you talking about? The Ouija board, I said, sitting up in bed. You didn't, do something after you left, did you? He laughed. Nah, man. I went home, passed out. Why? I didn't want to tell him about the calls yet. I wasn't sure why, but I felt weird about it. Maybe it was because a part of me didn't want to acknowledge it. Like if I didn't say it out loud, it wasn't real. I just thought you might have, done something. Freak me out, I muttered, trying to play it off like it wasn't a big deal. Nope. Though, to be honest, last night was creepy as hell. I wasn't expecting the board to actually work. He chuckled, but there was this nervous edge to it, like he wasn't totally joking. Maybe you should have said goodbye, huh? I frowned. You were the one who didn't want to. Yeah, well, he hesitated. I'm just saying. It probably would have been smart. We kept the conversation light after that, talking about random stuff like school and our plans for the weekend. The usual, but the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about the voicemail. The day passed in this weird haze. Everything felt off. My phone sat on the counter, face down, like I didn't even want to look at it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept hearing that breathing in my head, over and over. That whisper too. like whoever was on the other side was trying to reach me, but couldn't quite break through. By the time the sun started going down, I was so wound up I could barely sit still. I hadn't told Jess anything yet, mostly because she'd just tell me it was all in my head. But I had to talk to someone. This whole thing was getting under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. I sent her a quick text. "You up for a call?" A few minutes later, she responded with a simple, "Sure." I dialed her number, pacing around my room as I waited for her to pick up. She did after a few rings, sounding way more relaxed than I felt. "What's up?" I took a deep breath. "You're going to think I'm losing it." She laughed softly. "Cole, I already think you're losing it. What's going on?" So I told her. I told her about the calls, about the voicemail, about the breathing. She stayed quiet the whole time, not interrupting once, which was unlike her. By the time I finished, I was almost out of breath, like saying it all out loud had drained me. There was this long pause, and then she finally spoke, her voice a little softer than before. "You didn't answer any of the calls?" "No," I said quickly. "Of course not." "Good." Her tone was serious now. You don't think it's really her, do you?" I scoffed. How could it be?" "I don't know, Cole. The whole thing's weird. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Stress, maybe." I wanted to agree with her. I wanted to say that was exactly what it was, that I'd been so on edge lately that my brain was screwing with me. But that voicemail, it didn't feel like a trick. It felt real. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. It was around midnight when I got the next call. I was in bed, my phone on silent this time because I didn't want to deal with any notifications. But when I rolled over to check the time, I saw it. My mum's number. It had only rung once and then stopped. No voicemail this time. I stared at the screen, the missed call notification glowing in the dark. My stomach was twisted in knots, my mind racing with every possibility. I don't know why, but I felt this weird, almost compulsive urge to call it back. It's crazy, right? Why would I do that? But something in me was pulling toward the phone, like I needed to know. Without thinking, I swiped to the call log and pressed the number. The line rang once, twice, and then it picked up. But no one spoke, just silence on the other end. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I whispered, "Mum." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and then I heard it again. That slow, ragged breathing. I froze. My mouth was dry, my skin crawling with goosebumps. The breathing got louder, closer, like someone was right there on the other end, just waiting. And then, just before I could hang up, I heard it. A voice. Software. Weak. "Cole, help." Part 3. The recording. I didn't sleep that night either. After that voice, my mum's voice, said my name, I hung up. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I just slammed my thumb on the screen and cut the call off so fast you'd think the phone was burning my hand. I sat there in the dark, shaking, the silence in the room suddenly too loud. My skin was crawling, every hair on my arms standing straight up. "Cole, help." Those words kept replaying in my mind, like a broken record. It didn't make any sense. She sounded like herself, but not quite. Her voice was weaker, like someone was struggling to speak. And that breathing, I couldn't get it out of my head. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops and say, "Hey, I'm getting phone calls from my dead mum. Could you check it out?" They'd either laugh me off or send me straight to a psych ward. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I hit record on my phone. I know it sounds crazy, but in that moment, I felt like I needed proof. Something solid. Something that could make sense of all this. If this really was some sort of prank, I wanted evidence. And if it wasn't, well, I needed to hear it again, as much as I hated the idea. My thumb hovered over my mum's number for a second, just long enough for me to think, this is a terrible idea. But something pushed me to do it anyway. I called her back. It rang once, then twice. I was holding my breath, my whole body tense, and then the line clicked open again. This time, I didn't say anything. The breathing started up almost immediately. That same heavy, rasping sound, like someone who'd run a marathon and couldn't catch their breath. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my fingers trembling, waiting for something more. Part of me hoped I'd hear her again, but the other part was terrified of what she might say next. Seconds passed, nothing but that breathing. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. Not a word this time. A sound, something metallic, like keys jangling, or maybe chains. My heart was in my throat. I didn't move. The sound was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was there. I held the phone tighter, as if squeezing it would somehow make the sound clearer. And then, just before I could react, the call ended. The screen went black. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just heard. Was it her? Was it my mom? Why would she ask for help? What was that sound? I replayed the recording immediately, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. When I listened back, the breathing was there, just as clear as it had been live. But the jangling sound, it was even creepier than I remembered. The faint metallic clink echoing through the static like some sort of distant warning. That's when I realized something. The sound wasn't random. It was familiar. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat there, racking my brain for where I had heard that sound before. And then it hit me. I remembered when the cops came to the house the night my mom died. They had taken me to the police station to ask a bunch of questions. Standard procedure, they said. But when they brought me back, the car they found my mom in had already been towed to a junkyard. They told me I didn't need to see it, that it wasn't in my best interest. I didn't argue, but a few days later, I overheard my uncle talking to my dad. He mentioned something weird. When they pulled my mum's car out of the wreckage, they found something tangled up around the brake pedal. A chain. No one ever told me why it was there. No one even brought it up again after that. I guess they figured I didn't need to know. The brakes failed, she lost control, and that was the official story. End of discussion. But now that sound, the same faint clinking I heard through the phone, it was all coming back to me. And it felt like a piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. But what the hell did it mean? Why was my mom calling me from beyond the grave, whispering for help? And why was I hearing the sound of a chain? By the time the sun came up, I was completely wired. I hadn't slept in 2 nights, and my head was buzzing with 100 different questions. I decided to go to the junkyard. Maybe the car was still there, though it had been almost a year since the accident. Either way, I needed to see it for myself. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I wasn't even sure I'd find anything, but the thought of sitting around and doing nothing made my skin crawl. So I drove out to the junkyard on the edge of town, a cold pit settling in my stomach the closer I got. The place was desolate, rows of twisted metal and broken down cars piled on top of each other, rusted frames, shattered windows, just a graveyard for things people didn't want anymore. It was eerily quiet, like the whole place was stuck in time. I parked my car and started wandering between the wrecks, searching for something familiar. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't even know if the car would still be here. But after about 20 minutes of walking, I saw it. My mum's car. It was sitting toward the back of the lot, its front end completely smashed in, the windshield cracked like a spider web. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I had come this far. The door was locked, but I managed to pull it open with a bit of effort. The inside was worse than I expected. The airbags had deployed, and everything was covered in this thin layer of dust, but I didn't care about any of that. I knelt down by the driver's side and looked under the steering wheel, my hands trembling. There, twisted around the brake pedal, was a rusted chain. The same chain they had mentioned. My blood ran cold. It was real. All of it. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone had put that chain there. Someone had... My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I scrambled to pull it out, expecting to see my mom's number again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a text from an unknown number. I stared at the message, my breath catching in my throat. It was just 2 words. She knows. I stumbled back from the car, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart was pounding, and I glanced around the empty junkyard, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The phone buzzed again. You shouldn't have looked. Part 4. The visitors. My hands were shaking as I stared at the phone, the words, "You shouldn't have looked," glaring back at me. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming for me to get out of that junkyard. I don't know why, but something told me I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I shoved the phone back in my pocket and started backing away from the car. I could feel eyes on me. You ever get that feeling? Like someone's watching you, even though you can't see them. That's how it felt right then. I glanced around the empty rows of rusting cars, my breath coming out in short, ragged bursts, but there was no one there. At least, no one I could see. Still, the air was heavy, thick with a kind of tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stayed a second longer, something was going to happen. I didn't want to wait and find out what, so I turned and ran. By the time I made it back to my car, my whole body was trembling. I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. My hands were slick with sweat, slipping against the steering wheel as I sat there, trying to catch my breath. I should have driven off right then, but I didn't. I couldn't. My phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look. Every bone in my body told me that whatever came next wasn't going to be good, but curiosity, or maybe just plain fear, made me pull it out. Another message, same unknown number. "We're coming." My blood ran cold. I felt like I couldn't breathe. We? I didn't know what that meant, or who we were, but something about it felt too real, too immediate. I put the car into drive and floored it, my tires screeching as I sped out of the junkyard. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. My mind was racing, the words from that text blurring in my head. "We're coming." What the hell did that mean? Was it just someone messing with me, or was this connected to whatever had been calling me from my mom's number? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I was a target. I glanced in the rearview mirror constantly as I drove, half expecting to see headlights in the distance. But the road behind me was empty. Still, that uneasy feeling never left. I got home a little after dark. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My dad was out of town for work, and I hadn't told anyone else what I'd been dealing with. I didn't want to either. The whole thing was so bizarre, so unsettling. I didn't even know how to begin explaining it to anyone. I locked the door behind me and went straight up to my room, my mind still buzzing with everything that had happened at the junkyard. I tried calling Jess, but she didn't answer, so I sent her a quick text asking her to call me when she got a chance. I didn't mention the texts, not yet. I didn't want to freak her out before I knew what the hell was happening. I spent the next couple of hours pacing around my room, checking my phone every few minutes, like some part of me was waiting for another message. But nothing came. No calls, no texts, just silence. By midnight, I had convinced myself that maybe it was over. Maybe whoever had sent those texts was done messing with me, but that didn't explain everything else. The calls, the voicemail, the chain around my mum's brake pedal. I was desperate for answers, but the more I thought about it, the more everything just spiraled, like there were pieces to a puzzle I couldn't see yet. And then, just as I was starting to settle down, the doorbell rang. I froze. It was late. Too late for anyone to be showing up unannounced. I crept to my window and peered out, my stomach twisting into knots. The front porch light was on, casting long shadows across the yard, but no one was there. At least, not that I could see. The doorbell rang again. This time, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I stared at the door, every fibre of my being telling me not to open it. Something was wrong. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, my hands shaking as I stared at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "Open the door, Cole." I dropped the phone. The sound of it hitting the floor barely registered. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mouth dry, my skin ice cold. I backed away from the door, my legs feeling like they were going to give out any second. The doorbell rang a third time, long and insistent. I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body was frozen with fear. Then, as I stood there rooted to the spot, something strange happened. The doorknob started to turn, slowly, like someone on the other side was testing it, trying to see if it was locked. I backed up further, my breathing coming out in shallow, panicked bursts. The knob twisted back and forth, but the door didn't open. Whoever was out there wanted in. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning with fear, and I kept thinking back to the junkyard, the texts, the chain. Was this part of it? Was this the we from the message? And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The doorbell went silent. The doorknob stilled. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for something to happen. For whoever was out there to try again. But nothing came. I slowly, cautiously, crept back to the window. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the front porch. Empty. I must have stood there for another 10 minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to grab my phone off the floor. My hands were still shaking as I unlocked the screen. No new messages, no missed calls. Just that same gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my car keys and bolted out the back door. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house. Not after that. Something, or someone, was after me. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out what they wanted. As I sped down the road, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. I glanced down at the screen and almost swerved off the road. It was my mum's number. Part 5. The truth. She didn't want me to know. I didn't answer the call. I couldn't. My hands were white-knuckling the steering wheel, the screen glowing with my mum's name like it was mocking me. I was on some deserted road, the streetlights too far apart, casting long, eerie shadows. The phone kept ringing, and the more it rang, the louder the sound seemed to get. The whole car felt like it was vibrating with the weight of it. I finally snapped and threw the phone into the passenger seat. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed space from it. I needed air. But when the ringing stopped, I realized something even worse. There was a voicemail. I didn't want to listen to it. I didn't want to hear that voice again, that strained, hollow echo of what used to be my mum. But I also knew I had no choice. Whatever was going on, I was too deep in it now. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart was pounding as I pulled over to the side of the road. The world around me was silent, except for the wind rustling through the trees. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands, swiping the notification to play the voicemail. At first, it was just the breathing again, slow, laboured, almost as if the person on the other end was struggling to stay alive. My heart thudded in my chest as I waited, feeling sick to my stomach. Then came the voice, quiet, raspy, like it was barely able to form words. "Cole, don't dig." I froze. My skin crawled with dread. Don't dig? What was she talking about? I hadn't dug anything up. I hadn't done anything except look at the car. There was a long pause, and I thought the message was over, but then she spoke again. I didn't Mean to... I felt my throat tighten. Her voice cracked with something that sounded like regret or fear. But before I could think too much about it, the voicemail cut off, leaving me alone in the quiet of my car, staring at the phone like it was going to explode. I didn't know what she meant by "don't dig," but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened to my mum, she was trying to warn me now. I wasn't supposed to find out what really happened. That's what the texts had meant. That's why the calls had started. Someone, was trying to keep me away from the truth, but I was already too close. The next day, I went to the police. I didn't tell them everything. I mean, how was I supposed to explain that I was getting phone calls from my dead mum? They'd lock me up in a psych ward before they'd take me seriously. But I did tell them about the chain I found around the brake pedal. I told them I had doubts about the accident. I told them I wanted them to take another look at the investigation. The officer at the desk gave me a tired look, like he'd heard it all before. But when I mentioned the chain, his expression changed. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded and told me they'd look into it. He took my contact information and told me to go home. I left the station feeling unsettled, like I had set something in motion that I couldn't stop. I didn't know what was coming, but I had this sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't good. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house had me clutching my phone, waiting for it to buzz or ring. But it never did. No more calls, no more texts, just silence. It wasn't until the next day that I got the news. I was sitting at home, staring blankly at the TV, when my phone buzzed with a text. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was from the police. They had found something. I went back to the station, my heart pounding the whole drive there. When I walked in, the officer from the day before met me with a grim look on his face. He led me into a small room and sat me down, then slid a file across the table. "We reopened the investigation," he said quietly. "It looks like the brakes weren't the only thing tampered with." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What do you mean?" He opened the file and pulled out a few pictures. My mom's car, the brake pedal, the chain I had found. But there was something else. Scratches, deep, jagged marks around the engine, like someone had tried to rip something out or put something in. "We found evidence that the car was sabotaged," the officer said, "and we also found this." He slid another photo across the table. It showed something small, metallic, hidden deep inside the brake system. It looked like a tracking device. I blinked, my brain struggling to keep up. "A tracking device?" The officer nodded. "We're not sure how long it was in there, but it was well hidden. Whoever did this wanted to make sure your mum couldn't stop the car, and they wanted to keep tabs on her while she was driving." My head was spinning. But why? Who would do that? The officer hesitated. "That's what we're trying to figure out, but we found fingerprints on the chain." My stomach dropped. "Whose fingerprints?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Your dad's." I sat there in shock, the room spinning around me. My dad. The one person who had been there for me after my mum's death. Who had reassured me that everything was going to be okay. Who had lied to my face. "It doesn't make sense," I muttered, barely able to form words. He loved her. He wouldn't... But the pieces were falling into place now. The texts, the warnings. She knows. My mum had figured it out, and she had been trying to protect me ever since. I drove home in a daze, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a crushing force. My dad had been out of town for work, or so he said. But was that really where he was? And why had my mum's voice told me not to dig? She didn't want me to know the truth. She was trying to protect me from what she had uncovered in her final moments. When I got home, the house was dark, empty. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the front door, wondering what would happen next. Would I confront my dad? Would I get more calls? More warnings? But no, there were no more calls after that. Just silence. I don't know if it's really over. I don't know if my dad will ever admit what he did. But I do know one thing for sure. Sometimes the dead try to protect us from the truth. And sometimes the truth is better left buried. My friends and I used a Ouija board for fun. Now, one of them has gone missing. Part 1. The Invitation. All right, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I'm honestly freaked out right now and could use some advice. I'll give you guys the whole story, start to finish, and you can tell me if I'm just being paranoid. It started a couple of weeks ago, at a house party. You know the kind, someone's parents are out of town, and suddenly, half the school is crammed into a 2-story house, loud music, drinks, and people you don't even know. My friends and I were chilling upstairs, trying to stay away from all the chaos. It was me, my buddy Nate, his girlfriend Sarah, and our other friend Jason. Pretty typical night until Sarah mentioned the Ouija board. Now, I've always been pretty skeptical of that stuff. Ghosts, spirits, whatever, I figured it was all in people's heads. But Sarah, she was really into it. She told us how she got the board from some creepy shop downtown and how it supposedly worked for her before. You could see her eyes light up when she started talking about it, like she wanted something freaky to happen. Nate rolled his eyes, and Jason didn't say much, but he looked a little nervous. Jason's always been kind of quiet, but that night he seemed more on edge than usual. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, looking back, I feel like I should have known better. Sarah convinced us to try it. I wasn't into it, but after a few drinks, I figured, why not? It was just a game, right? I didn't think for a second it would turn into anything more than a dumb party trick. We were bored, and it seemed like a way to kill time while avoiding the drunk idiots downstairs. So, we all gathered around a coffee table in Nate's parents' living room, lights dimmed, the whole vibe set like some cheesy horror movie. I've got to admit, when Sarah pulled out the board from her bag, I got this weird feeling in my gut. The board wasn't like the ones you see in stores. You know, those mass-produced ones with bright colours. This one looked old, like really old. The wood was worn, and the letters were carved into it by hand. It smelled faintly of something earthy, like damp wood and mould. The planchette was this triangular piece of bone or ivory, polished smooth from years of use. I felt this shiver run down my spine, but again, I brushed it off. I didn't want to be that guy, freaking out over a stupid board game. Jason looked uneasy too, but Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement. Nate was just laughing, calling us wimps for even hesitating. Let's see if we can talk to some dead guys, Nate joked, pushing the planchette into the middle of the board. Sarah gave him a look, but she didn't say anything. We all put our fingers on the planchette, and Sarah started asking the usual questions you hear about Ouija boards. Is there anyone here with us? Stuff like that. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I felt kind of dumb sitting there, but we all just kept our fingers on the thing, waiting. Nate started cracking jokes about how Sarah got scammed, how this was just some old piece of junk. But then, the planchette started to move. I swear to you, none of us moved it. I could tell Nate wasn't doing it because I could see the look of surprise on his face. He tried to play it cool, but you could tell he was rattled. Jason, on the other hand, went pale. His eyes locked onto the board like he couldn't look away, and I could feel his hands trembling next to mine. It spelled out one word: T-H-E-M. We all stared at the board, confused. Sarah's smile faded a little, and even she looked like she didn't know what to say. Them? Who's them? She asked, her voice suddenly quieter, more serious. The planchette started to move again, this time faster. T-H-E-W-A-T-C-H-E-R-S. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped a few degrees. Nate laughed nervously, but no one joined him. Jason, still pale, finally spoke up. His voice was shaky. Maybe we should stop. Sarah, of course, didn't want to. She was too into it now, like she was waiting for something big to happen. No, we've got to keep going, she said, her eyes wide. We're getting answers. But something didn't feel right. You know that gut feeling you get when you just know you're not supposed to be doing something? That's what I felt. Like we were pushing boundaries we shouldn't have even approached in the first place. Nate, sensing the tension, shrugged. Come on, it's just some dumb game. But even he wasn't laughing anymore. The room had this heavy, oppressive feeling, like the air itself was thick. I wanted to stop. Jason wanted to stop. But Sarah kept pushing. What do you want? She asked the board, and her voice echoed in the stillness. The planchette didn't move at first, and for a moment I thought maybe it was done, like we'd reached the end of the weirdness. But then it started again, slow and deliberate. S-A-R-A-H. Her name. That's when Jason lost it. He yanked his hands off the board, knocking the planchette off in the process. Nope! Number, we're done! His voice cracked, and he stood up, looking more scared than I'd ever seen him. Sarah looked pissed, but Nate, for once, wasn't laughing. He glanced around the room like he was expecting something. Someone to appear out of the shadows. It sounds stupid, I know, but in that moment, I felt the same thing, like we weren't alone anymore. We put the board away after that, or at least tried to, but that's not where the story ends, not even close, because after that night, things started happening, weird things, and now, Jason's missing. After that night, things didn't feel the same between us. It's hard to explain, but there was this tension. You'd think we'd just laugh it off, right? But no one was really joking about it the next day. It was like everyone knew something had shifted, even if we didn't want to say it out loud. A few days later, we all met up at Nate's place again. This time, though, it wasn't for a party. Just the four of us hanging out like usual. The vibe was off from the start. Jason, who's usually the first to crack a smile or make a dumb joke, was acting strange. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting to see someone there, following him. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "I've been having weird dreams lately. Probably nothing." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but I could tell he was lying. There was this look in his eyes, not the kind of thing you get from a nightmare, but something worse, something deeper. The night went on pretty normally at first. We played video games, ordered pizza, and talked about how boring our town was. Everything was fine, until Sarah brought up the Ouija board again. "I was thinking about what happened last weekend," she started casually, like she wasn't about to stir the pot. "Don't you think it's weird how it spelled my name?" Nate groaned. Here we go. But Sarah wasn't joking this time. "No, I'm serious. I've been looking into it, and the Watchers are supposed to be some kind of, I don't know, group or something. Like spirits that keep an eye on people, maybe even mess with them." I don't know what I expected her to say, but that just made the air in the room heavier. Nate tried to laugh it off, but even he couldn't hide the fact that he was freaked out. And Jason, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. "Sarah, you need to drop this," Jason said quietly. His voice was tight, almost like he was holding something back. "I'm just saying it's weird, okay?" She shot back, clearly annoyed. "Don't you guys want to know what we contacted?" Jason stood up abruptly, knocking over his drink. "Number, I don't want to know. I don't want to talk about it. It's over, all right?" His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. The room went silent. Even Nate stopped trying to make light of the situation. Jason mumbled an apology and grabbed his jacket. "I'm heading out," he said, avoiding eye contact with any of us. We tried to get him to stay, but he wasn't having it. Without another word, he left, slamming the door behind him. We didn't see him for days after that. That's when the weird stuff started happening. It began small, Just little things at first. Doors closing on their own, lights flickering, stuff you could explain away if you tried hard enough. But I couldn't shake this feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. I'd be sitting in my room, doing homework, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see movement in the hallway. Just a shadow, like someone walking past. But when I looked, no one was there. I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe I was still rattled from the Ouija board incident. But then, one night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. This faint tapping noise. It sounded like it was coming from inside my walls. At first, I thought it was the pipes, or maybe a branch scraping against the house. But then the tapping moved. It wasn't random anymore. It was slow, rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping their fingers against the wall, trying to get my attention. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but then it started again, this time louder, closer. I jumped out of bed and flicked on the light. The room looked normal, nothing out of place. But that didn't stop the creeping feeling in my gut, the one telling me I wasn't alone. I stood there for a minute, just listening. The tapping had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that noise was still there, lurking just out of sight. That's when my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, desperate for a distraction, and saw a text from Jason. "Can't sleep. It's getting worse." I stared at the message, my hands cold. I knew exactly what he was talking about, even if I didn't want to admit it. I typed back, "What's getting worse?" He didn't reply. I stayed up for hours waiting for his answer, but it never came. The next day, I texted him again, but still nothing. Nate said he hadn't heard from him either. Sarah tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. We even stopped by his house, but his mum said he wasn't there and hadn't been home in a couple of days. She figured he was just out with friends. But we were his friends, and none of us had seen him. That's when I started getting worried. We checked all the usual places, the skate park, the diner, even that creepy old warehouse on the edge of town where we sometimes hung out. No sign of Jason, no texts, no calls, nothing. It was like he'd just vanished. A few nights after he went missing, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in my hallway. My parents were asleep, and my younger brother wasn't home. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing outside my bedroom door. I froze, not daring to move. I listened as the footsteps came to a stop right in front of my door. The floorboards creaked under the weight of whoever, or whatever, was out there. Then, without warning, there was a knock. Just once. Soft, but firm. I don't know why I did it, but I got out of bed and walked toward the door. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to stay put, but my legs kept moving. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Just then, my phone buzzed on my nightstand. I rushed back to it, half expecting it to be Jason, but it wasn't. It was a message from an unknown number. "We're watching. Part 3. The numbers." I didn't sleep that night. After the message from the unknown number, I just sat there, staring at my phone, waiting for it to buzz again. But nothing else came through. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, but all I heard was the ticking of the clock on my wall and my own shallow breathing. The next day I told Nate and Sarah about the message. Sarah looked spooked for the first time since this whole thing started. She tried to brush it off, but I could tell it got to her. Nate, though, he was acting weird, even for him. He didn't say much at all, which was unusual. Normally, he'd be cracking jokes or making fun of me for getting freaked out. But that day, he just sat there, staring at his phone like he was a million miles away. I asked if he was okay, and he just shrugged. "Yeah, man, I'm fine. Just tired, you know?" but he wasn't fine. I could tell. The three of us decided to head over to Jason's house again, but his mum said the same thing as before. Jason wasn't home, and she hadn't heard from him. She seemed more worried this time, though. When she asked us if we knew where he might be, I didn't know what to say. What was I supposed to tell her? That her son might have been taken by some thing we contacted through a Ouija board? Yeah, no way that was going to go over well. We left Jason's house, feeling more lost than ever. That's when Sarah suggested we go back to Nate's place and check the Ouija board again. She was convinced that the answers we needed were still there. Nate and I both looked at her like she was crazy. After everything that had happened, the last thing I wanted to do was mess with that board again. But Sarah was persistent. "We need to understand what's going on," she said. "If we don't, we're never going to find Jason." I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. We had no leads, no clues, and things were getting worse. So, against my better judgment, we agreed to give it another try. That evening, we gathered back at Nate's house. This time, the atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was oppressive. The kind of heaviness that makes it hard to breathe, like something unseen was crowding the air around us. We didn't talk much as Sarah set the board up on the coffee table again. The planchette was still there, sitting in the middle like it had never been touched since the last time. The lights in the room flickered as we sat down, and I had this overwhelming urge to bolt, to just leave and never come back. But I stayed. I'm not sure why. Maybe because a part of me was hoping this would all end once we had some answers. We placed our fingers on the planchette, and Sarah immediately started asking questions. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette didn't move at first, just like before, but then slowly it began to glide across the board. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. It spelled out something quickly, too quick for comfort. Y-E-S. Sarah's eyes lit up, but I could see the fear behind her excitement. Nate's face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like he was waiting for something to jump out of the shadows. I couldn't blame him. The whole room felt wrong. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, faster this time. The answer chilled me to the bone. W-E-A-R-E-H-E-R-E. I looked at Sarah. What the hell does that mean? Before she could answer, the planchette started moving again, almost violently this time. It spelled out one word, over and over, the letters forming like scratches on the board. N-U-M-B-E-R-S. We all stared at the board in confusion. "Numbers? What numbers?" Sarah, her voice trembling, asked. "What numbers? What are you talking about?" Suddenly, Nate jerked back, pulling his hands away from the board. "Stop. This is messed up. I don't want to do this anymore." He was sweating, visibly shaken. He looked at me and Sarah like we were strangers. "I've been getting these texts," he said quietly, almost like he didn't want to say it out loud, "from some random number. They keep sending me strings of numbers, over and over." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What kind of numbers?" He pulled out his phone and showed us. The texts were all from an unknown number, just like mine, but instead of words, they were long sequences of random numbers. I didn't know what to make of it, but something about it felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, but you feel deep down in your gut. Sarah's face went pale. "I've been getting them too," she whispered, pulling out her phone. She had the same texts, the same random strings of numbers. None of us knew what to say. The three of us, all getting these messages right after Jason disappeared. It couldn't be a coincidence. Suddenly, Nate's phone buzzed in his hand. He jumped, nearly dropping it. Another message. We all crowded around as he opened it. The text was short this time, but no less disturbing. 971342. Just numbers. But they felt like more than that. Sarah grabbed her phone and checked her messages. She had the same text, sent at the exact same time. I checked mine, and sure enough, There it was. 971342. We all just stood there in stunned silence, staring at our phones. Then Sarah spoke, her voice shaking. What if these numbers mean something? What if it's coordinates or a code? I didn't know what to think. But at that point, I was willing to believe anything. We sat down and started plugging the numbers into maps, search engines, anything we could think of. But nothing came up. That's when Nate said something I'll never forget. What if these numbers aren't from here? Sarah and I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? I asked. Nate hesitated, then said, what if they're not coordinates on Earth? What if this is like, I don't know, a message from somewhere else? I stared at him, my heart sinking. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was being ridiculous. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. The temperature in the room seemed to drop again. The lights flickered once more, and then, without warning, the power went out completely. We were plunged into total darkness. My phone buzzed again, but when I checked, there was no new message, just the same numbers, repeating over and over, filling my screen until it looked like nothing but a sea of digits. And then, in the dark, we heard something, a soft whisper coming from somewhere in the room. It was Jason's voice. Part 4. The Whispering. The darkness in Nate's house was suffocating, like a thick blanket pressing down on us. None of us moved at first. We just stood there, frozen, listening to that soft whisper that sounded way too much like Jason's voice. It was faint, but distinct, coming from the corner of the room near the window. Help me. That's what it said, clear as day. But it wasn't like Jason was actually there. No, this was different. It sounded distant, like it was being pulled through layers of static or something. A part of me wanted to believe we were just freaking ourselves out, that this was all some sick prank or my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. Sarah was the first to react. She fumbled for her phone, shining the flashlight around the room. The light cut through the darkness in jagged beams, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. No Jason. No one. But then, we heard it again. Help me. This time, it was louder, closer, almost right behind us. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over the coffee table, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The light from Sarah's phone caught Nate's face, and he looked terrified. His usual cocky, laid-back attitude was completely gone. He was staring at the window, where the voice seemed to be coming from, his eyes wide and unblinking. We have to leave, Nate muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to get out of here, now. I didn't argue. None of us did. We grabbed our stuff and bolted for the door, practically tripping over each other in our rush to get out of that house. The second we stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But something was wrong. The neighborhood was off. You ever get that feeling where something looks familiar but doesn't feel right? That's what this was. The streetlights flickered above us, casting weird, shifting shadows across the empty street. Everything was way too quiet. No wind, no distant cars, no crickets. Just dead silence. Nate, Sarah, and I stood there on his front lawn, trying to figure out what to do next. Sarah was shaking, still clutching her phone like it was some kind of lifeline, while Nate kept glancing around, his hands twitching like he was ready to run at any second. We can't stay here, Nate said again, more urgently this time. That wasn't Jason. Whatever that was, it wasn't him. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. That voice, it might have sounded like Jason, but there was something off about it, something hollow, like an echo of who he used to be. And those texts, those numbers, None of it made any sense, but every part of me was screaming to get as far away from that house as possible. Just as we started walking, my phone buzzed again. I looked down, half expecting more numbers, but this time it was a call. From Jason. I stared at the screen, my hand shaking. Nate and Sarah saw it too, and they both stopped dead in their tracks. "Answer it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to let it ring, to ignore it. But something made me press the screen. Maybe it was the hope that Jason was okay, that somehow all of this could be explained away. But the second I answered, I regretted it. The call connected, and for a moment, all I heard was static. This low, buzzing hum filled the line, like someone was pressing a phone up against an old TV that wasn't getting a signal. Then, through the static, I heard it. That same voice. Jason's voice. "Help me!" But this time, it was distorted, almost robotic, like it was being run through some kind of filter. It repeated again, over and over. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen in horror. It didn't hang up. It just kept playing the same phrase over and over, until finally it stopped. Just silence. And then, a sound I will never forget. A deep, guttural breathing, like something was watching us, something not quite human. My heart dropped, and I hit the end call button, but it wouldn't disconnect. The breathing just got louder, filling the air around us. I dropped the phone, and it hit the ground with a thud, the screen going dark. What the hell was that? Nate's voice cracked, his usual bravado completely gone. Before I could answer, Sarah gasped. "Look!" She was pointing at Nate's house. The windows were black, not just dark, black, like someone had covered them with thick pitch-black paint. And on the door, scratched into the wood, was the same string of numbers we'd all gotten in those texts. 971342. We all backed away, instinctively moving toward the street. My pulse was racing, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up again. A notification, a video message. It was from Jason's number. I stared at the screen, my stomach knotting. "Guys, I just got a video from Jason." Sarah and Nate both huddled close as I opened the message. The video was dark, grainy, like it had been filmed on an old camcorder. At first we couldn't see anything, just static and shifting shadows. Then the camera panned up, and we saw him, Jason. He was standing in the middle of a field, his back to the camera. The grass around him was tall and wild, swaying in a wind we couldn't hear. He didn't move, didn't turn around. He just stood there, staring off into the distance. Then, slowly, the camera zoomed in, and that's when we saw it. Behind him, in the distance, were figures. Dozens of them, standing completely still. Their faces were blank, like shadows with no features, just humanoid shapes that barely seemed real. They weren't moving, just watching. The camera kept zooming in, closer and closer to Jason. The figures got clearer, more defined, their shapes becoming more human, more real. But there was something wrong with them. Their bodies were twisted, distorted, like they'd been stretched too far, in all the wrong directions. Jason still hadn't moved. But then, the figures in the distance started to. Slowly at first, then faster, like they were drawn to him, closing in from every angle. Just as they were about to reach him, the screen went black. We all stood there in stunned silence, the cold air wrapping around us like a vice. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling. What were those things? Nate shook his head, backing up toward the street. "We need to get out of here. This isn't right." I bent down, picking up my phone again. The screen was blank, the video gone. But just as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed one last time. I glanced down, and my heart stopped. Another text from Jason's number. It was a single word. "Run." Part 5. The Vanishing. After that last text, we didn't wait around. We ran. No one said a word. We just bolted down the street, the wind whipping at our faces, our footsteps echoing through the empty night. The houses around us blurred into shadows as we sprinted, hearts pounding, lungs burning. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like forever. Every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision felt like those figures from the video closing in on us. We finally stopped at the gas station a few blocks away, out of breath and drenched in cold sweat. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. For a moment we just stood there, hunched over, trying to catch our breath. But none of us felt safe. Not here, not anywhere. Nate pulled out his phone, frantically checking the messages again, scrolling through them like he was trying to find something that made sense. "What the hell are we supposed to do?" he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. This isn't normal, man. This isn't how this is supposed to go." "Calm down," Sarah said, though her voice was shaking too. "We need to figure out what those numbers mean. There's got to be something, some clue." I stared down at my own phone, the screen still showing that last text from Jason. Run. But where? From what? And those numbers. 971342. They kept flashing in my mind, like some kind of broken code. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice low. "What if the numbers aren't coordinates? What if they're not even directions?" Nate shot me a look. "What the hell are you talking about?" I hesitated. It sounded crazy, but at this point, everything felt crazy. "What if they're..." A countdown. Silence. Sarah and Nate exchanged glances, their faces pale in the flickering light. Sarah was the first to speak. "A countdown to what?" "I don't know," I admitted, fear twisting in my gut. "But think about it. Every time we get a message, something worse happens. The lights flicker, we hear Jason's voice, then the video. It's like something's closing in. What if the numbers are counting down to them finding us?" Nate shook his head, his voice shaky. "No, man, that's insane." But Sarah wasn't so sure. "What if he's right?" she whispered. "What if that's why Jason disappeared?" None of us had an answer. We just stood there, huddled under the flickering lights, trying to make sense of something that had no logic, no reason. It felt like the ground was crumbling under us, like we were falling into something we couldn't stop. Then, in the silence, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I had to. When I checked the screen, my blood turned to ice. 971341. The last number had changed. It had gone down by 1. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, staring at her own phone. "It's a countdown. It's really a countdown." Nate cursed under his breath, panic flooding his face. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here. Now." "Where are we supposed to go?" I asked, frustration boiling over. "We don't even know what we're running from. Those things in the video, whatever they are, they're everywhere. They could be anywhere." Sarah's phone buzzed next. She looked down, her face going pale. "Guys, we're not getting out of this. The numbers, they're counting down to 0. And I think when they hit 0, it's over." The cold realization settled in. We were out of time, out of options. But before we could make any kind of plan, the streetlights outside the gas station flickered violently and then went out completely. The only light left was the dim glow from our phones. The air around us grew heavy, thick with the same oppressive feeling we'd felt in Nate's house. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nate turned to run, but before he could take a step, something stopped him. His phone buzzed again, and when he looked at it, his face went white. "Jason," he whispered. I looked over his shoulder. It was another video message, but this one was different. It was a live feed. The screen showed a dark, empty room with nothing but shadows. But as the camera moved, we saw someone sitting in the middle of the floor. It was Jason. His back was to the camera again, just like in the previous video. But this time, he was rocking back and forth, muttering something under his breath. His voice was too low to hear, but there was no mistaking that it was him. Then the camera panned, and we saw them. The figures from before, the watchers. They stood in the background, still, silent, their twisted bodies swaying ever so slightly, like they were waiting for something. Watching. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my ears as the camera zoomed in on Jason, his muttering growing louder. I could barely make out the words, but they sounded like numbers. He was repeating the countdown. 9, 7, 1, 3, 4, 1. The same numbers we'd been getting. He was counting down to 0. Suddenly Jason stopped rocking. His body went completely still. And then slowly he turned to face the camera. I can't even describe what I saw. It was Jason, but it wasn't him. His face was blank, pale, his eyes dark and hollow, like he wasn't even alive anymore. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just a silent scream. And behind him, the watchers started moving. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. We need to go. We need to go now. But Nate and Sarah were already backing away, their eyes wide with terror. The darkness around us seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was swallowing the world inch by inch. And through it all, we could hear the faintest sound, whispering. It was Jason's voice, repeating the countdown over and over, getting louder, closer. 9, 7, 1, 3, 4, 1, 9, 7, 1, 3. Nate grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the street, but the world felt like it was collapsing around us. The streetlights flickered back to life for a brief moment, casting long shadows across the pavement. And that's when I saw them, the watchers. They were standing at the edge of the gas station lot, just outside the ring of light, their distorted bodies swaying unnaturally. There had to be at least a dozen of them, maybe more, all watching us with their featureless faces. They didn't move, not yet, but I knew they were waiting for the countdown to reach 0. I turned and ran, dragging Nate and Sarah with me. I didn't know where we were going, didn't care. All I knew was that we had to get away, had to put as much distance between us and those things as possible. But as we ran, my phone buzzed one final time. I glanced down, my heart hammering in my chest, 971340, and then silence. Jason was never found. Neither were Sarah or Nate. I'm the only one left, but I don't think I'll be here much longer either. I've been hearing the whispers again. They're coming for me. The countdown always ends. The Ouija board told us to look behind you. We saw shadows moving in the room. Part 1. Just a game, right? It started on a Friday night like any other. A couple of my friends and I were bored out of our minds, hanging out at John's place. You know the vibe. Lazy weekend, ordering pizza, scrolling through Instagram, no real plans. John's place was like our default hangout because his parents were always out of town. Not in a neglectful way, more like they travelled a lot for work, so we always had the house to ourselves. Anyway, it was me, John, Rachel and Mike, our usual crew. We had just finished watching some trashy horror movie, the kind where you can predict every jump scare a mile away. And we were all complaining about how horror just wasn't scary anymore. We needed something real, something that could actually freak us out. Now let me just say, I've always been the skeptic in the group. Ghosts, demons, haunted houses. None of that stuff ever really got to me. I didn't believe in it. Mike, on the other hand, was always the one pushing us to try something crazy. He's the guy that still reads those clickbait articles like top 10 scariest things found in the deep web and believes every word. So when Mike casually mentioned we should mess with a Ouija board, I rolled my eyes. Dude, seriously. But John perked up. He was all in. Rachel was hesitant, but intrigued. She had this weird fascination with the paranormal, though she'd never admit it outright. John disappeared upstairs for a few minutes and came back holding this old wooden Ouija board. It looked ancient, like something you'd find buried in a box in your grandma's attic. The edges were frayed, the letters faded. I half expected it to be a cheap knockoff from some Halloween store, but John claimed it belonged to his grandmother. "That's a little creepy," Rachel said, eyeing the board. "Your grandma actually used this?" John shrugged. "I don't know. My mum gave it to me when we were cleaning out the house after she passed away. Figured it'd make a cool decoration or whatever, but if you guys are too chicken..." Classic John, always pushing buttons. We decided to set it up in the middle of the living room, lights dimmed, candles lit for effect, Mike insisted. It was all a joke to me at that point. I figured we'd sit around, move the planchette ourselves, and freak each other out for laughs. Nothing serious. It's just a game, right? We all sat down in a circle around the board, fingers barely touching the planchette. I could tell Rachel was already nervous, her eyes darting between the board and the shadows flickering from the candles. Mike was grinning like he had just won a bet, and John was leaning into it, playing the part of the mystical leader. "All right," John said, putting on this deep, dramatic voice. "Spirits, if you're here, let us know." I had to stifle a laugh. It was so over the top that I couldn't take it seriously. But after a minute of silence, Rachel's nervous energy seemed to creep into the room. We all got quiet. There was this weird tension building, and I wasn't sure if it was because we were actually freaked or just feeding off each other's anxiety. Nothing happened at first. The planchette stayed still, and I was about to crack a joke when Mike broke the silence. "Is anyone there?" Suddenly, the planchette twitched. I mean, it barely moved, just a little shift to the left. I thought someone was messing with it, probably Mike or John trying to spook us. But when I glanced up, everyone's face was dead serious. "Okay, who's screwing around?" I said, half laughing, but already feeling uneasy. "I swear it wasn't me," John said, lifting his fingers off the board to prove his point. Mike did the same. Rachel stayed quiet, her hands trembling. "Guys, I don't like this." I tried to brush it off. "It's nothing, Rachel. Probably just friction or something." But then it moved again. This time slower, more deliberate. It slid toward the letters, almost like it was being pulled. My fingers were still on it, and I swear I wasn't moving it. Neither was anyone else. It spelled out LOOKBEHIND. Rachel froze. "No way," she whispered. "No freaking way." I'm getting chills just thinking about it now, but at that moment, my heart was pounding. Mike laughed nervously, trying to play it cool. All right, who's messing with us?" No one said a word. John cleared his throat, but I could hear the crack in his voice. "I'm serious, guys. Is someone moving it?" The room was dead silent, except for the faint flicker of the candle flames. For some reason, none of us could bring ourselves to look behind us. It was like we didn't want to see what might be there. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my skin crawling. Rachel whispered again, almost like she didn't want anyone or anything to hear. "Do you guys feel that?" Feel what? The room was still, too still. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. It was like the air had been sucked out, like we were sitting in a vacuum. But it wasn't just the quiet that got to me. It was this overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone anymore. I didn't want to admit it, but something about that damn board felt off. Then, without warning, the candle closest to Mike flickered violently and went out, and the shadows started moving. Part 2. Something's wrong with this house when the candle went out. Everything changed. The mood in the room flipped from playful to something much darker in the blink of an eye. I know it sounds dramatic, but it suddenly felt like the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, none of us moved. We just stared at each other, waiting for someone to say something. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice shaky. That's not funny. Who blew out the candle?" But no one answered. Mike stood up, slowly backing away from the board like it was a bomb about to go off. John just sat there, staring at the space where the candle used to flicker, his face pale. I don't think I've ever seen him look so freaked out, and John was never the type to lose his cool. I tried to keep it together, to think rationally. Maybe a draft had blown the candle out, but then I remembered. The windows were all closed, the AC wasn't even on, and the house had always felt stuffy in a way that made the sudden chill even weirder. I didn't say anything though. I didn't want to make it worse. I was about to suggest we pack it up when Rachel gasped. Her eyes were wide, staring at the far corner of the room. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I saw something move, right there, by the door." Mike, always the skeptic despite being the one to suggest the Ouija board, tried to laugh it off. "You're just freaked out because of the candle, Rachel. There's nothing there." But even as he said it, I could see him glancing over his shoulder, eyes darting around like he didn't quite believe his own words. Rachel shook her head, backing away from the corner. "No, I saw something. I'm not crazy." I didn't want to say it, but I thought I had seen something too. A shadow maybe? A flicker of movement in the dim light? But it didn't make sense. The only light in the room was from the candles, and with one of them out, the darkness seemed to press in on us even harder. We all stood there, tense, waiting for someone to make the first move. It felt like we were trapped in that moment. And then, something strange happened. The planchette started moving again, this time with no one touching it. I swear, we were all standing a good few feet away from the board, but the damn thing moved. Slowly at first, then more quickly, dragging itself across the letters. Rachel whimpered. "Guys, this isn't funny anymore." It spelled out Leave. Mike was the first to react. He laughed, more out of nervousness than anything, and said, "All right, cool prank, John. How'd you rig this thing?" John shook his head, eyes still locked on the board. "Dude, I didn't. I swear, I didn't." And the look on his face? I believed him. I've known John for years. He's a lot of things, but a liar isn't one of them. His face was pale, like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe, just maybe, we all had. "I'm done," Rachel said, stepping back. "I'm not messing with this anymore. Let's just leave. This house has always been weird, and I don't want to be here when whatever this is happens." She wasn't wrong. John's house was weird. I'd been there 100 times, but there was always this feeling like you weren't alone, like the walls had eyes or something. I'd brushed it off before, old house, creaky floors, the usual stuff. But now, standing there in the dim light, the air thick with that weird, oppressive vibe, I wasn't so sure anymore. The shadows, they were moving. I saw it too. Not in the corner where Rachel had pointed earlier, but along the walls, like something was shifting just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was just the candles flickering, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Mike, who'd been the bravest of all of us a few minutes ago, now looked like he was on the verge of bolting. "All right, fine, let's just stop. Maybe we did something wrong. I don't know. This is getting weird." As if on cue, the last candle flickered, its flame sputtering like it was struggling to stay lit. The shadows danced on the walls, growing darker, thicker. I could feel something in the room with us now, something watching. And then we heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, maybe a car passing by or something. But it wasn't. It was too close, too deliberate. Leave. It was barely audible, like someone was speaking right in my ear, but so soft that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked around to see if anyone else had heard it. Judging by the looks on their faces, they had. John swallowed hard, finally breaking the silence. Okay, yeah, let's get out of here. Without a second thought, we all headed for the door. But the moment John reached for the handle, there was a loud bang from upstairs, like something had slammed shut. We all froze. What the hell was that? Mike asked, his voice barely more than a whisper now. I didn't want to find out. We need to leave, like now, Rachel insisted, her voice cracking. John grabbed the doorknob and twisted it hard, but it didn't budge. He tried again, yanking it with both hands. The door wouldn't open. I don't understand. It's unlocked, he said, panicking. Before any of us could say anything, the whisper came again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Look, behind, you. I swear my heart stopped. None of us moved. None of us wanted to move. I felt the blood drain from my face as that same overwhelming chill from earlier swept over the room. Slowly, I turned my head, and in the corner of the room, where the shadows had been shifting, someone was standing. It was just a silhouette, but the outline was unmistakable. A tall figure, almost too tall for the room, its head brushing against the ceiling. No features, just darkness. It didn't move, but the weight of its presence was crushing. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Rachel let out a choked sob, and John stumbled back from the door. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Part 3. Trapped with it. None of us spoke. We couldn't. My legs were frozen to the spot, my breath shallow and panicked. That thing in the corner, whatever it was, it didn't belong here. And the worst part, it knew we were terrified. You could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like smoke. Rachel was the first to react, but not in the way I expected. She didn't scream or run. She just backed up, slowly, pressing herself against the wall, eyes wide, her lips trembling like she was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. The rest of us weren't much better off. John still had his hand on the door, yanking at the knob over and over as if the sheer force of his willpower would magically make it open. Mike, the one who'd been so eager to play with the Ouija board, looked pale, like all the colour had drained from his face in an instant. His hands were shaking, and for the first time since I'd known him, Mike looked genuinely scared. No more cocky grins, no more jokes about how it was all just a trick. He kept glancing between the door and the thing in the corner, like he couldn't decide whether to try for an escape or just bolt the other way. But none of us moved toward the figure. It stood there, impossibly still. Too still, like a statue made of shadows. The room seemed to get darker the longer it stayed there. I could barely make out the details of the furniture anymore. The couch, the coffee table, even the Ouija board, all of it faded into this suffocating blackness that wrapped around us. And then, it stepped forward. I swear, it didn't make a sound. Not a creak on the floorboards, not a shuffle of movement. It just shifted, one foot in front of the other, slow and deliberate, like it was savouring every second of our fear. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs were locked in place. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's coming closer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what possessed me to look back at the Ouija board, but I did. Maybe I thought we could still fix it. Maybe get rid of this thing by saying some magic words or asking it to leave us alone. But when I glanced at the board, I felt a sickening drop in my stomach. The planchette was moving again. None of us were touching it, but it was moving fast, darting from letter to letter in this frantic, almost angry way. I couldn't keep up with what it was spelling, but the scraping sound it made against the wood was like nails on a chalkboard, screeching in the thick silence of the room. John was still pulling at the door, practically slamming his shoulder against it. Why won't it open? He hissed through clenched teeth. John, stop, Mike said, his voice shaking. It's locked, man. It's not gonna... I didn't lock it, John shouted, finally turning to face us. His eyes were wild, desperate. I didn't lock the damn door. But before any of us could respond, the lights flickered. The single remaining candle flickered too, its flames swaying violently as if it were caught in a windstorm. But there was no wind. The room was deathly still. I don't know if you've ever felt a kind of fear that makes your body go numb, like every muscle is locked in place and your brain just refuses to process what's happening. That's how I felt in that moment. Helpless, trapped. All I could do was stare at the figure as it stepped forward again, closer and closer. I wasn't even sure it had a face. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a tall, thin shadow, its presence more real than anything else in that room. And yet, I felt like it was looking at me, like it had singled me out. Then, just when I thought it was about to reach us, everything stopped. The planchette on the Ouija board went still. The flickering lights steadied. The candle, now barely more than a stub, cast a weak, trembling light over the room. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then a new sound filled the room. Knocking. It started slow at first. Just a single heavy thud from upstairs. We all froze, listening. Another knock, louder this time. Then another, and another. It was like something was pounding on the walls or the ceiling, trying to get our attention, or worse, trying to get in. Mike broke the silence. What the hell is that? We didn't have time to answer, because the knocking turned into full-on banging, like fists slamming against the walls from every direction. It wasn't just upstairs anymore. It was the ceiling above us, the walls to our sides, even beneath the floor. The whole house was vibrating with this deafening noise, like it was coming alive around us. Rachel screamed and bolted toward the back of the room, cowering behind the couch. I wanted to run too, but where could we go? The door wouldn't open, and every instinct in my body was telling me not to get any closer to that thing in the corner. John was still fighting with the door when suddenly the banging stopped. The silence was worse. That suffocating, crushing silence. You know how sometimes silence can be loud? It was like that. A pressure building in our ears, pushing in on us from all sides. Then, in the stillness, that whisper came again. Look behind you. It wasn't coming from the figure this time. It was coming from all around us, like the walls themselves were whispering. I could hear it in my ear, cold and breathy. And I swear, the shadows on the walls were shifting again, crawling across the room like living things. Rachel was sobbing now, curled up behind the couch, and Mike just stood there, his back to the door, eyes wide with panic. John finally stepped away from the door, defeated, staring at the thing that had crept halfway across the room toward us. And that's when I realized there wasn't just one shadow. There were more, dozens of them, moving along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. Some were small, slithering across the floor, others tall and thin, almost human-like. They filled the room, surrounding us, cutting off any chance of escape. We were trapped, and they were closing in. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was Rachel, maybe it was Mike. But in an instant, we all broke. Panic took over, and we scattered, running in different directions like wild animals trying to escape a predator. But no matter where we went, the shadows followed. Part 4. Nowhere to run. It was chaos. Pure, frantic, gut-wrenching chaos. Rachel bolted for the stairs, stumbling over her own feet as she tried to get away from the shadows closing in on us. Mike was right behind her, yelling for her to wait, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of those whispers growing louder, echoing through the house like they were coming from every direction. Behind you. Behind you. I stayed frozen for a second too long, watching the way the shadows crawled up the walls and stretched across the floor like ink spreading over water. John grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "Come on," he shouted, pulling me toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My brain had switched to survival mode, and all I knew was that I had to move. Had to get away from that thing in the corner and the army of shadows swirling around us. We stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind us. I don't know why we thought that would stop them. It wasn't like a flimsy door could hold back whatever the hell this was. But we were desperate. The banging started again, louder this time, vibrating through the walls like a drumbeat. It was relentless, each thud reverberating in my chest. John's eyes darted around the hallway, wide with fear, like he was trying to figure out where to go next. The house wasn't big, and every exit seemed impossible now. We need to get to the basement," John panted, his voice hoarse from yelling. "There's a door down there that leads outside." I didn't like the idea of the basement. It was the last place I wanted to go, but what choice did we have? The shadows were still moving outside the door we had just slammed shut. I could see them creeping under the crack, dark tendrils slithering toward us. We didn't have time to think. John yanked open the door to the basement, and we bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. The wooden steps creaked under our weight, the sound echoing eerily through the narrow space. The light down there was dim, just one old bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting long, jittery shadows over the walls. We reached the bottom, and I immediately scanned the room for the exit. The basement was cluttered with old boxes, tools, and random junk. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I didn't see the door John was talking about. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice tight with panic. John was already shoving aside a pile of boxes in the far corner. "It's behind here. Help me move this crap." I rushed over, helping him push aside the junk. But the more we cleared, the more it became obvious that something was wrong. The door, it wasn't there. John stood frozen, staring at the blank wall like it had betrayed him. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. "It's supposed to be right here. I swear it's right here." But it wasn't. The wall was solid. No door, no window, no way out. I felt my stomach drop. There was no escape. We were trapped. The basement suddenly felt 100 times smaller, the walls closing in around us. The banging had stopped, but that wasn't comforting. It was worse. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and unsettling. The shadows were creeping down the stairs now, slow and deliberate, like they knew we had nowhere left to run. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. John didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the empty wall, completely lost. Suddenly, we heard footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above us. We both froze, listening. The footsteps weren't like ours, though. They were heavier. Each step seemed to shake the house, like whatever was up there was far bigger than any of us. I didn't want to think about what it could be, but I had to know. "Rachel! Mike!" I called out, hoping, praying. It was them. Maybe they'd found a way to help us. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice called out from upstairs. A voice that wasn't Rachel. A voice that wasn't Mike. "Come. Upstairs." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The voice was deep, almost inhuman, like it was being spoken through a broken radio. John shook his head, backing away from the stairs. "We can't go up there, man. We can't." But what choice did we have? We were trapped down here with the shadows closing in. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying in the basement wasn't going to save us. The shadows were already crawling down the walls, inching closer to where we stood. And then, the light bulb flickered. I grabbed John's arm, pulling him toward the stairs. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. He hesitated, his eyes darting between the stairs and the creeping darkness. But he didn't argue. We ran. Back up the stairs, through the hallway and into the living room where the shadows had first started. And when we got there, the room was empty. No shadows, no figure in the corner, no sign of Rachel or Mike. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe we had outrun it. But then I saw it. The Ouija board sitting on the coffee table, planchette resting in the center, and right beside it, the single candle, the one that had gone out earlier, was now burning again, its flames steady and strong. And the whispers, they were back. Come. Closer. John shook his head, backing away. No, I'm not going near that thing again. But I couldn't help it. I felt this strange pull, like something was drawing me toward the board. Against every instinct, I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the planchette. It was moving again, all on its own, sliding across the board in smooth, deliberate motions. And then it stopped, spelling out one final word, R-U-N. Before I could react, the door to the basement slammed shut behind us, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in front of me, fogging the air as the shadows returned, creeping out from the corners of the room. This time, they weren't slow. They surged forward, engulfing everything in their path. And in the center of it all, the figure returned. It wasn't just standing in the corner this time. It was moving toward us, faster than before. Its arms, long and spindly, reached out as it closed the distance. John was already yelling, his voice a mix of panic and terror as he ran for the front door. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows wrapping around me. Then, just as the figure reached me, everything went black. Part 5. The final move. When the world went black, I thought that was it. I thought I was dead. I expected to feel nothingness, to just stop. But I was wrong. The darkness didn't consume me like I thought it would. Instead, it felt like I was suspended in it, floating in this void where time didn't exist. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, but I could feel. My heart was still pounding, my chest tight with fear. And then, slowly, the world started to come back into focus. It wasn't immediate, more like a fog lifting. First, I heard a faint sound, a low buzzing, almost like static. Then the cold hit me again, sharp and biting. My body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and that's when I realized where I was. I was back in the living room. The Ouija board was still on the table, the candle flickering weakly beside it. But the shadows, they were gone. The figure that had been chasing us. Gone, too. The room looked normal again, like none of it had ever happened. Except it had. John was lying on the floor next to me, gasping for breath, his eyes wide and unfocused. I could hear him muttering to himself, "It's not real, it's not real." Over and over, like a broken record. He was shaking so badly that I wasn't sure if he even realized I was there. But where were Mike and Rachel? I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. "John," I said, my voice hoarse, "we need to find them. Mike and Rachel, they're still in the house." John didn't respond. He just kept staring at the floor, lost in his own fear. I shook his shoulder, harder this time. "John, snap out of it, man." Finally, he looked at me, his eyes hollow. "They're gone," he whispered, barely audible. "They're already gone." I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't. There was no way they could be gone. We had all been in the house together just minutes ago. We had to find them. There was no way we were leaving without them. Ignoring John's dazed state, I stumbled toward the stairs, calling out their names. "Mike! Rachel! Where are you?" No answer. Just silence. The house felt bigger somehow, emptier. Each step I took echoed through the halls, like I was the only living thing left inside. The shadows were no longer swirling around, but the memory of them clung to me, like they were still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. I reached the top of the stairs, and looked down the hallway, my breath catching in my throat. The door to Rachel's room was open, but it didn't look right. The light inside was dim, almost flickering, and the air around it seemed distorted, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. I approached slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my pulse racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stepped through that doorway, there would be no coming back. But I had to know. I had to see. When I stepped into the room, it felt like I'd walked into another world. The air was thick, suffocating, like I was underwater. Rachel was standing in the middle of the room, her back to me. She was perfectly still, facing the far wall. Something was wrong. Her body was too stiff, too rigid, like she wasn't in control of herself anymore. "Rachel," I whispered. She didn't move. I took a step closer, my voice trembling. "Rachel, what's going on?" Then she spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was low, guttural, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, and it sent a chill straight through my spine. "You shouldn't have come back." Before I could react, she turned around, her eyes black as coal, her face pale and twisted in a way that no human face should ever look. My heart lurched in my chest and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, stuck in place as she stepped closer. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. "You didn't listen." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The walls around me started to shift, the room warping into something dark and endless, swallowing the light, swallowing me. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, dragging me down into the same darkness I had felt earlier. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my arm. John. He had come up behind me, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "We need to go. Now." Rachel, or whatever she had become, stood there, just watching us with those dead black eyes. She didn't follow as John dragged me out of the room, back down the hallway. The house felt even more alive now, like the walls were breathing, the floor shifting beneath our feet. We made it back to the living room, gasping for breath. The candle on the table was flickering violently now, and the planchette was moving again, spinning in circles on the Ouija board like it was possessed. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't help it. It stopped suddenly, spelling out one final word, D-O-N-E. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the room went still. The air felt lighter, warmer, like whatever had been there was finally gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. John collapsed on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "It's over," he muttered. "It has to be over." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to pretend that everything we had just experienced could be forgotten, that we could move on like none of this had happened. But deep down, I knew better. Things like this don't just end. They linger. They haunt. Mike and Rachel were never found. We told the police everything. Well, almost everything. There was no way we could explain the shadows, the voices, the thing that had taken Rachel in that room. They searched the house, of course, but there was nothing to find. No signs of struggle, no evidence they had even been there. It's been weeks now, and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see those shadows creeping along the walls. I hear the whispers, feel the cold breath on the back of my neck, and every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can see it. The figure, just standing there, watching. The Ouija board, we burned it. John insisted on it. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that was enough. Because every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, I hear that same faint whisper that started it all. "Look, behind you." And I'm too scared to ever turn around.